If you carry a firearm and discharge your weapon in self-defense, you could face hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and expenses. So carry the protection of CCW Safe, Self-Defense Legal Services membership. Upfront payment of all criminal and civil defense costs with no out-of-pocket for members.
Imagine this scenario. A mass casualty attack hits 3 American cities simultaneously. Within the first 5 minutes, cellular networks are overloaded, EMS is overwhelmed, and law enforcement is stretched past its breaking point. Panic buying empty store shelves inside the hour. Emergency broadcast activations contradict each other. And the average American family, no communication plan, no situational awareness, no layered readiness, freezes completely. That's not a movie, that's the gap. And tonight we're going to help you close it. The Iranian proxy warfare network and the Al-Qaeda and ISIS radicalization pipelines are the threat behind all of this that we're going to be discussing tonight. These are not lone wolves acting on impulse. They're trained, embedded, and patient operatives coordinated across sleeper cells inside the United States, moving through the same infrastructure gaps that most Americans ignore. They exploit your confusion. They exploit your failure to act in the first 5 minutes. They exploit the fact that most American families have no plan and no communication protocol when things go loud. Go loud. That is what they want, paralysis. Tonight, we strip that advantage away from them. It's March 31st, 2026, and this is Survival Dispatch News. I'm Chris Evans, the CEO of Survival Dispatch. I'm joined tonight by a retired NYPD detective out of the Spec Ops Division, CBRN instructor and preparedness educator with Mira Safety, George Sickler, one of the sharpest real-world preparedness minds working today. Bottom line up front, most Americans are building their readiness posture around the wrong threats, freezing in the first 5 minutes of a real incident, and skipping the fundamentals that actually keep families alive. The gap between raw intelligence and real-world civilian action is where people die. And that gap is wider than most people realize. So what we're going to cover tonight is how real incidents actually unfold, decision-making under stress, high probability versus high consequence threat prioritization, and layered home and family readiness built on reality, not perception. So jumping into the first segment, the first 5 minutes, how real incidents actually unfold. Most civilians have built their mental model of a crisis from movies and news coverage, not from how incidents actually develop on the ground. And that gap gets people killed in the first 5 minutes. Real incidents open with chaos, conflicting information, and a hard delay between the event starting and anyone around you understanding what is happening, which means your preloaded decisions are the only decisions that will actually fire under pressure. The families who move, orient, and protect in those first 5 minutes are not the ones with the most gear. They're the ones who ran the mental reps before the day came. And if you want more information on improving your situational awareness and reaction time, that's exactly what SDN Guardians get for only 33 cents a day. So let's get George on stage here. Good evening, George.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I can't thank you enough for being here, George. I want to jump right in with the first 5 minutes. Like, walk us through what the first 5 minutes of a real mass casualty event actually looks like from a law enforcement perspective that's not the Hollywood version.
Sure. So what I'll say first and foremost is the body will never go where the mind has never been, right? So if they haven't practiced those mental exercises like you were talking about, we cannot expect them to play on Super Bowl Sunday and quick kick, a 55-yard winning field goal when they've never done that before, right? That repetition is practiced so many times before at that level. We're talking about people that don't have a similar mindset to you or I, and it's not so much where it's wrong place, wrong time. What I like to say now is, any place, anytime, unfortunately. And being mentally prepared is one of the most important things that you could do. So when we're on the X, so to speak, that point of impact, point of injury, whatever it's going to be, the bad actor and the law enforcement and that civilian, we all three of us want the exact same thing, and that thing is time. The bad guy, the bad actor, wants more of it, and law enforcement and the civilian that's affected want less of it. So the first and foremost thing they have to do is to not be in denial and recognize when an emergency is taking place, and then figure out how they put enough time and distance between them and what is actually taking place. So recognizing that an emergency is taking place and not being in denial, to me, that is the most critical component, that you see people freeze and they don't know what to do because they've never been there before mentally.
Yeah, I know I'm paraphrasing, but I always think of Sun Tzu, that the human beings don't rise to the occasion, they fall to their level of training, right? So
100%.
just
100%.
a quick note for our viewers tonight. It seems that there's an issue at Substack right now. I'm going to see if it can get us connected here in just a second when George is speaking again. So, George, I mean, you've seen all kinds of calamities as NYPD, I'm sure. What are the most common failure points for civilians, not law enforcement, not trained professionals, but civilians? And why? Like, why do they have these failures beyond lack of training?
So, in my opinion, I spent a lot of time in December down in Manhattan doing what we spoke about previously, doing that security detail. And I was kind of shocked and appalled and blown away by the amount of everyday citizens that would walk around with noise canceling headphones and their faces buried in their phone. So when you talk about no situational awareness, they're completely oblivious to anything that can take place. Now, and again, my opinion, if that TikTok video is so important, you need to watch it on the subway, keep one earbud in. You need to be able to hear if somebody's screaming for help or somebody's saying to get out of the way. So they're not situationally aware. And when they're not situationally aware, they walk around hoping that nothing is going to happen to them. And again, hope is not a plan to me.
Well, actually, let's drill down a little bit on that, because, people like yourself, myself included, will say to somebody, keep your head on a swivel. But we get a lot of questions from people. What exactly does that mean? Maybe you could go through the concept of Colonel Cooper's colors.
I was going to bring it up.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead and roll with that. You don't need me to preface it.
Yeah. So it's a great place to start, right? And that came back, I guess, out of the 60s or the 70s, by a colonel. And the color codes of awareness are pretty simple. White, yellow, orange, and red. And when you walk through them in stages of awareness, I'll break it down pretty simply. So condition white only happens in your home. That you can lock the door, you can go to sleep, you could, have a glass of wine if you wanted to, and you could be unaware of your surroundings at that point, where you could really, in essence, let your guard down. And the only place that you're allowed to be in condition white would be in your home. When you leave your house, you should be in condition yellow. And that's not a heightened level of awareness. That's just a general awareness of what's going on around you. And it's a nice day out. Do I need a jacket? Do I need a raincoat? What's going on around me? The birds are chirping, right? You just go outside and you have a general awareness of what's going on, because you know what normal looks like in your day-to-day life. Condition orange is something has my attention. I don't know exactly what's going on over there, but I want to keep my eye on that, because if I don't, that it could have a negative impact on me or my family or whoever I'm going to be with. And then lastly, condition red being that I need to take emergency action right now, because if I don't, it's going to have a detrimental effect on me. So I teach this a lot, and I bring it back to a story where I always say, I get up in the morning to go teach a class, and I'm having a cup of coffee in my house in condition white, and everything is great. I go outside to start the car, and it's a beautiful day outside like it was today. It's a little bit warmer than I expected, and the birds are chirping. It's a little overcast. It might be a little bit rain, but I have a general awareness of what's going on around me. I start the car, I drive down the driveway, and I can hear a siren approaching from my left and going to my right. So I stop the car and I say, let me see where that siren is. Let me not pull out in front of whatever it is, because it's got my attention. I'm in condition orange, that I'm aware of something going on. The ambulance would go from left to right, and I look to proceed, and I drive out of the driveway, but have to slam on my brakes immediately, condition red, because a car was speeding up behind them, right? So not everything is a gun battle. That just in your every general day-to-day life, you need to be in that yellow, just because I'm aware of what's going on. You can't operate in orange every day because it would be mentally exhausting, but again, going from white to yellow to orange to red, and you can go back and forth in between those color codes. But, to go back to that subway anecdote that I was talking about, those people are in condition white on a New York City subway or a New York City street, completely unaware if a bus loses control. They're just not in a position to help themselves. They're hoping that nothing goes wrong, right? And we're not saying something goes wrong every single day, but at some point you have to be able to recognize that you take your own safety into account. And that's just a general awareness. It's pretty simple.
Man, that was a great synopsis of that. By the way, I call these things weapons of mass distraction.
You did say that. That's great. Yeah. I'll tell you what, Chris, you've heard of the KISS method of teaching, keep it simple, stupid.
Yes,
I'm the CASE method of teaching, copy and steal everything. So I'm going to steal that from you. All right. But that's fantastic.
Honestly, I probably stole it from somebody myself. So go right ahead. So let me throw a number at you, George, and you're probably aware of this. Obviously, the firearms, concealed carry and open carry laws here are different in Florida than New York.
Yep.
Would it surprise you to know that 70% of Floridians who are killed by gunshot wound who did not commit suicide are killed each year with their own firearm because they pull it out, they go into condition black, the bad guy takes the gun away and shoots them with their own gun. I know Colonel Cooper didn't coin the condition black. Somebody tacked that on afterwards. But it's pretty crazy the number of people who go into condition black. Maybe give us your rundown on that type of mental state and how to avoid it, if anything.
It's a great. So I would call it condition purple, right? So I'll get to your question there. And we talk about law enforcement or as a soldier, military operator, right? And you're hunting somebody with a gun, and I would say to my students, well, what color code do you think I'm in? And they automatically go red, and I go, no, we're in purple, right? Like we don't want to be in that position, and it's you're so hyper elevated at that point, right? What I would say to the people, unfortunately, that are being disarmed is, if the gun is coming out of the holster, again, this is opinion, okay? And situation and circumstance will always dictate reality. But if the gun is coming out of the holster, it's because you are in fear for your imminent safety, meaning life or death, okay? That if you don't act at this level of force, the likelihood of you being killed or seriously physically injured is very, very high. Sometimes I think that people take a firearm out of the holster in an attempt to fix bad behavior, meaning they're the ones that potentially could instigate or escalate that. And then that person on the other side that maybe never intended deadly physical force, now deadly physical force is being used against them, and they turn the table. So when you get into that purple or that black that you're talking about, right? In purple, I can still operate, with some mental clarity, but black, they're just not seeing it. And the other thing that I'll say to my students is, I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Everybody that, law enforcement or military, really has the ability to say that. But what I will say to you, and that was in a uniform capacity, what I will say is that in off duty, okay, 25 years, 27 years off duty, how many times my firearm has been out of its holster off duty, and people are shocked to hear that number is 0. Okay. Because again, going back to those color codes of white, yellow, orange, and red, if something gets me to orange, I don't want to go to red. I want to be able to react appropriately and kind of move away from that and get out of that position. versus having to get stuck in that environment. And now you've got a firearm out when maybe it shouldn't have been out. Again, I don't know the circumstances around those incidents you're talking about. They're terrible. But when you get to condition black, it's that line in the sand. Don't take another step. Somebody takes another step. Don't take another step. They take another step, right? You really backed yourself into a corner, and it goes back to those mental exercises that you were talking about, where the body will never go where the mind has never been. So, we would train in law enforcement. I'm sure Department of Defense would do something similar, but I would say the same thing to my civilian clients. It's you don't pull a gun out of the holster and say, I'm going to blow your head off. That's not appropriate. Right? Like you need to be able to say, you need to get away from me because I'm in fear of my life. Whatever your mental training is going to be, you need to be act appropriately and frame it in a context, especially now where you're going to be on a video camera somewhere, right? If you say the wrong thing, it's going to be used against you.
Let's go down a bit of a rabbit hole here,
Sure.
George, and I'm sure your opinion is the same. Anybody who has a choice that knows what they're talking about, has a choice between being shot and stabbed, will take being shot over being stabbed. I've got a friend of mine, Shannon Rich. I'm going to just tell you what he went through, and then I want to get your take on it. So Shannon has more pro MMA fights than any other MMA fighter who's alive today, okay? And he also owns an executive protection company. He was Sheriff Mark Lamb's personal protection, and Mark's a friend of ours as well.
Oh,
so,
sure.
so Shannon goes to, I think it was a Twin Peaks restaurant with his coach. And by the way, his coach reminds me of, Rocky Balboa. I'm trying to remember what his coach was Mickey. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. But I don't have Alzheimer's. I get sometimes I remember, sometimes I forget. Anyway, they go to this Twin Peaks restaurant. He leaves his pistol in his car because they serve alcohol in this establishment. They come out at the end of the fight. He goes to get in his car. His pistol's in the door of the car, and there's a crowd of people behind the car, and he can't back out. And he says, "Hey, y'all, could you let us pull out of here?" And this young Hispanic guy starts going off on him, F you, blah, 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 and all this stuff. And Shannon's like, hey, man, like, we're just trying to get out of the parking spot. I don't want to fight you or anything like that. And the guy pulls a fixed blade and starts running at him. And Shannon's instant reaction is to run away, right? And so they go around the car 3 times before he's able to retrieve his pistol. He retrieves his pistol, and now he's backpedaling, and this guy's running at him with this knife, and he keeps saying to him, I don't want to shoot you. Stop, stop, stop. Next thing you know, his back's against the outside wall of the restaurant, and he shoots this kid at point blank range, 2 feet away. The pistol to this kid's neck was 2 feet, and he shot him with this fragmenting ammunition from Pilgrim Ammunition. So it goes about 4 or 5 inches deep, and then it, as you know, fragmenting, it splits. The hydrostatic shock goes sideways, right? It didn't go through the kid's neck, thank God, because there are all these people behind it. That's clearly not an optimum situation for somebody put in that type of situation. Now, obviously, he's an exception because he's a physical specimen and he's got tons of experience. Give our audience the lowdown on what your recommendation is if somebody pulls a knife and starts charging you. You have a gun. You're in a stand your ground state like Florida. We're not attorneys, by the way. We're not giving anybody advice. But run through that scenario for me as far as what you would teach somebody to do.
So the stand your ground state is probably something that I've never experienced, right? Up where I live in the Northeast, we are a duty to retreat state, and it's significantly different, right? So I don't really want to pretend, that I would appropriately answer a stand your ground part. But what I would say, regardless of the context, that, if you go back to that teller drill, that 21-foot standard rule, and if people aren't familiar with that, it's probably a 1970s video. You can Google it really quick. And it shows a law enforcement officer, very close, proximity to an individual. And basically what it means is within 21 feet, there is a 100% chance that other individual is going to strike you with their hand, regardless of what's in it. If it's a knife, it's a fist. If it's a tire iron, a screwdriver, there's a 100% chance. And the other way they call it is the reactionary gap, right? And that reactionary gap takes some time to do. And if you think about law enforcement or open carry, you have a bit of an advantage there because the firearm is not concealed, right? It's exposed. And in the civilian world, if you have to conceal it, you have one more step in that process, which is to defeat the concealment garment and then draw from the holster. So at about 15 feet, the chances of you getting a round off on target and hitting that target is pretty good. However, there is still a 100% chance that that individual is going to strike you with whatever they have in their hand, right? So again, the best context is I don't want to get hit at all with anything. And that really starts to happen about 20, 21 feet. And I remember very clearly as a rookie police officer with my partner, we would, you go knock on an apartment door, and those tiles, tiles are generally 12 by 12, right? So they're a foot. And then in a vestibule of an apartment complex, you don't have 21 feet. And you've got to be reasonable to think that, okay, if they were to open up the door and it was to pop off very quickly, I don't have that 21-foot standard. So how do I start giving myself an advantage? And that would be positioning yourselves on either side of the doorway, right? Like just again, or maybe taking a step up a stairwell because it keeps going up, and then you have a little bit of some sort of a barrier in between. But when you get into that close proximity where you're talking about your friend or anybody literally with their back against the wall at that point, it's reasonable to think that there is no alternative other than to use deadly physical force to protect yourself from deadly physical force.
Yeah, so I like how you mentioned duty to retreat. We were the first state in 2006 to get stand your ground, and most people would be surprised by this, but let me just pull this up quickly here. That's the entire law right there. It's 4 sentences long. And at the end of the day, and I'm not going to read the 4 sentences if y'all want to search on it, it's easy to find, but essentially stand your ground in Florida, not to be confused with castle doctrine, because I caught somebody in the live chat discussing home defense. They're not the same thing.
Correct.
So as George mentioned, we don't have a duty to retreat in Florida. We don't have a duty to retreat in Texas. And here's how crazy this is. Like George Zimmerman escalated a situation that should have never been escalated, but he should have never been charged per the law. Pam Bondi charged him for political reasons, knowing full well he wouldn't have been convicted, right? Because the standard here in Florida is your life doesn't have to be in danger. All it has to be is your perception is that your life is in danger or somebody else is in danger, and you are therefore authorized to use deadly force. And at the end of the day, let's go back to the stabbing stuff, George. So if somebody is closer than 21 feet and they come at you with a knife and you shoot them, they're probably going to keep coming at you. What does that scenario look like from real world stuff that you've seen when you were on duty?
That forward momentum is what's going to carry them still forward, right? Like I'm an old 50-year-old man with a knee replacement, and I'll still close 21 feet relatively quickly. But if you take somebody of even reasonable athletic prowess, just a 18 or 25-year-old young adult, they close in less than a second, and there's really no time to react at that point, and they're moving so quickly that forward momentum is still going to come through at that point, and you're getting that round off and out on target, but you still have potentially a knife in your chest at 21 feet. And again, there's always an exception to the rule, right? But at 21 feet, what you're able to kind of see is that person that's reacting, that they're able to move laterally and get off of that X, where even if the momentum was to still carry them forward, they can get an effective round on target and then be out of the way of that forward momentum. And the one thing that people always got to remember is action beats reaction 100% of the time, right? So whether you're law enforcement or you're a civilian, you don't know what that other person's going to do. Because what I like to say is, that bad guy gets a vote, and you don't know what their vote's going to be. They might decide to turn around and walk away. They might decide to turn around and get some friends, or they might decide to turn around and just, sucker punch you for whatever reason, right? But if you're able to create that time and distance, and how do you do that, right? Putting yourself, or a vehicle in between you and somebody else, or a table or a chair if you're in a restaurant, like anything that you're able to kind of create that distance to give yourself the ability to react where you're still going to be reacting, but they're acting, and that reactionary gap, you want to prolong it a little bit more.
Yeah, I love your choice of words and all of your answers, George. I love how you mentioned laterally. So I've got a bunch of buddies of mine who are snipers, including Mike Glover, and they will tell people, you know, if somebody's at a distance and shooting at you, not a hidden sniper, but somebody with a rifle or even a pistol, the last thing you want to do is run away from them or towards them. You want to move laterally because it's a much harder shot for the shooter. I like how you narrowed that down to the knife situation. You're the first person who said that. That makes perfect sense, though, whether it's close quarters or not.
Well, you think if you keep backing up, right? Like nothing changes. Like that sight picture doesn't change. That forward momentum doesn't change. If you get off, that's where off the X comes from, right? Like if you move laterally at that point, now you've got to have that attacker, that assailant, move like a linebacker. And again, I can choose to go left. I can choose to go right. They don't know what I'm going to do. So, you know, they have to now react to what I've done. But if I only run forward or backwards, that sight picture never changes.
Yeah, so we're way off the brief, just so you all know, but I want to tap into George's extensive experience and his ability to teach. So I want to pull up a video, George. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but this happened in Lumberton, North Carolina a few years back. And basically, I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version on it. A person carjacks an F-350 that's on a construction site. It's got toolboxes on it. A Good Samaritan who's working on that job site is 5 feet away from the perp, who's sitting in the driver's seat with the door open. The Good Samaritan pulls his sidearm, shoots 5 times from 5 feet away, and misses all 5 shots. This guy backs up a full 50 yards, puts his toe into it, and runs over the Good Samaritan, kills him DRT. This is just a great example of people not realizing that they lose their fine motor skills when their cortisol level spikes, their heart rate spikes. I'd like to get you to dissect this, though, George, since we've got you on. So let me play this. It's about 50 seconds long or so. And I don't think this video actually shows the ending. So here's the Good Samaritan. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you all out there. Give me 2 seconds here. It's as big as it's going to go.
I got it. We're good.
Let me just back this up for the benefit of our audience here so you can see it a bit better, so it's not quite as much of an eye test. Okay, so the door is now closed. Those were the 4th and 5th shots that he took. Look how far this guy backs up. Like, he doesn't back up a few feet, and I think that's what kind of threw the other guy off, because he didn't even realize the guy was charging towards him. And at that particular point in time, he hit him and he was killed DRT. Absolutely horrible situation. Give me a walkthrough on that, George, of the guy the guy with the gun. Like, sure. I don't know that it's a great idea to get involved in that capacity, to be quite honest with you.
So it's a great point, Mike, right? And I'll break that down for you again, based on my opinion. And I'll again base it on if that were to happen in New York. Okay.
Fair enough.
Again, you know, I know the law there pretty well. I don't know if Minnesota is a duty retreat, et cetera, but, you know, first and foremost, okay, your obligation, my obligation in a non-uniform capacity is what? And that is to go home to my family at the end of the day.
True story.
However, based on my training and experience, and I had a good friend that kind of put it into this analogy a long time ago. When you teach a dog to fetch, you can't be mad at him when he still fetches. Okay, meaning me, or a law enforcement officer off duty. Okay, that civilian, you are not in New York. You're not allowed to use deadly physical force to protect property. Period. Okay, so there's a couple other things that happen there, and the difference is, I'll break it down in this anecdote. So, you know, throughout my, you know, maritime special ops career, right? I'm a big water guy. I love sharks. They're the predators of the ocean, right? Everything's on the food chain. Terrain and circumstances dictate where, right? So let's say that I'm at the aquarium and I've got a beautiful $25,000 Rolex on my wrist, and the clasp breaks and it falls and it goes into the bottom of that shark tank with the sharks circling around. What do? I don't leave it, but I'm not diving in to get that watch. Okay. We're going to keep an eye on it. We're going to call maintenance or whomever, somebody get a broom, something. We're not leaving it, but I don't go in after that watch. On the flip side, let's say I'm at that same aquarium with the same sharks, and one of my kids leans over and falls in. What do? I go in right after them. So we start to have to understand the difference between life and property. Okay. So there, although thought he was acting in the Good Samaritan capacity, you're not allowed to use deadly physical force to protect property. Law enforcement's a different story. The second thing is, when we break down the firearm safety rules, right? Know your target and what's beyond. And what I break that down as, what's your penalty for a miss? So just because, I go down to, Manhattan and buy a guitar doesn't make me Jimi Hendrix and a guitar player. Just because I give somebody a firearm also doesn't make them a gunfighter. Okay. So you need to know where your skill and ability puts you in your role in society. Now, I don't know what that gentleman's training was. Unfortunately, it sounded to me like that he did not survive. I think that's what you said.
He died, yes.
It's terrible, right? For somebody that thought he was doing the right thing, and now his family is going to miss him terribly when he was trying to do the right thing. However, where does your skill and ability put you in your role in society? And again, those shots that he missed, all 5 of them, where did they go? So, you can start to break this down in many, many different layers. And what I'll say as a teaching point is, it's never one giant catastrophe that ends up in, this large scale, disaster. It's a series of smaller cascading events that lead to what you saw at the end of that video. And the special ops guys, the military guys will tell you what they're very good at. What we were very good at is recognizing that slow cascading pattern, and you have to recognize that and break that pattern, right? So if he decided to go over, and we're Monday morning quarterbacking this, but if he decides to go over and say, hey, get out of the car, because that's what he felt he had the moral obligation to do, then so be it. But the next compounding thing was, he used deadly physical force. It was ineffective. That person drove all the way back, and then he kind of stayed in the middle of the street for a little bit. And then what did he do? He decided at the very last second, again, cascading to get out of the way. And I don't know if we know the guy that was behind the wheel. Did he do it on purpose? We're trying to get it. Who knows, right? But, at the end of the day, there's somebody dead that shouldn't be dead, period.
Yeah. I mean, I think that his situational awareness spiked and then fell off as the guy was backing away, and he didn't keep his eye on the ball, which cost him his life, unfortunately.
It's terrible. There's a family at home that misses that man, right? And it's terrible, right? Like, to lose your life over something over an F-350, it's terrible. I hate to hear those stories.
There's a video out there, George, of his wife saying exactly what you just said. She misses him tremendously. It's funny when you mention, sharks. So I was born in 1969. I saw Jaws at a very young age. And, we live close to the beach here. But since I was knee high to a grasshopper, the only water sports that I participate in, showers. That's it. I don't go in the ocean here at all. I'm assuming you've heard of Tony Blauer.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Tony's a good friend of mine. Actually, I got to put him on the list of introductions for you, because he's such a super guy.
I got to become a show for me now, Chris. Thank you.
No, it's all great. I mean, that's my biggest piece of currency is my Rolodex. But I told this story recently. Apologies to the audience. I'll tell it really quickly, but it's germane to our conversation. So when things started really rolling for Tony in the 90s, he's getting contracts. He's making more money than he's ever made in his life. He takes the family to New York City for a vacation. And they're at the time, and you've probably seen this countless times, when somebody walked into these little convenience stores downtown New York, the person behind the counter, if they spotted somebody had a lot of cash or valuable jewelry, they would signal to somebody, one of their buddies, to roll the person after they left the store, sort of thing, right? So Tony's standing at the counter, he's paying the guy, and his spidey sense is going off. And the guy says, that's a really nice Rolex that you have there. And Tony is so freaking smart. He took the watch off. He handed it to the guy. He said, what, this piece of shit? I just bought it around the corner at the store. It looks just like a regular Rolex, but feel how heavy it is. It's just a knockoff. and the guy didn't call in anybody to mug him. So
Yeah, so here I'll give you another anecdote, Chris. So one of the things that I was doing for Mira Safety just recently, we're putting together a training curriculum, and in that course, I talk about Muggable Mary, who was an NYPD undercover detective back in the 60s or 70s, right? And so Muggable Mary would dress as a demure female, and she would go with, property of interest, that was, a little bit higher than what you would expect in that neighborhood, so there's value in it. And she would go into these high crime neighborhoods, and she would be followed by, her undercover team, right? They would follow her and observe her. And then when Muggable Mary the predators would come and they would go to rob her, the backup team would come in and they would effect an arrest. Of course, the city council loses their mind over that, right? And we lost that tool back in the 60s or 70s because it was, too aggressive. But, my generation of policing, we use a very similar tactic. You never knew when you were playing the game, right? So, and what I say was, as an officer, we would do the exact same thing. Like, we would look for somebody that would come out of, maybe a bar, that they were intoxicated or they were flashy with some clothes or some items. And then we would be able to follow them, from a distance, knowing that they were going to be a victim, right? So if I can pick out a victim, so can the predators, right? And that's exactly what you were talking about with Tony was, they're observing signs, and they're looking for people that look like a victim. Now, if they pick Tony, obviously they picked the wrong guy,
yeah.
But that's in essence what they're doing. And we would use that Muggable Mary, or the, Muggable Mike. They just never knew they were playing until we went in and it would affect an arrest if they were, victimized.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate you adding that anecdotal stuff. It's invaluable. Let's move on just a little bit here. What does decision making under stress look like? Let's say physiologically, not psychologically, but physiologically. And when you're training people, George, how do you train them not to freeze up? I mean, I can summarize it really quickly from Tony's perspective. He coined the term weaponize the flinch. So when you recognize that you're flinching because something's coming at you,
right,
immediately go on the attack as opposed to moving backwards. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the physiological side of that.
So when I would teach, mainly firearms, so to speak, and we would work in the civilian context, what I like to do is layer things, right? Like if you can't expect somebody to execute a certain skill under pressure flawlessly if they don't have the general basics down. So, as I break that down and we talk about, the firearm fundamentals. So what are the difference between, the soccer mom who bought her first, Glock 43 and, somebody that's on SEAL Team 6? What are the difference in those fundamentals? The fundamentals remain exactly the same: stance, grip, sight alignment, etc. Right? The difference is the execution of those fundamentals flawlessly under stress. Okay. So what I would typically do was start to give them the bare bones and make sure that they were competent at that level, and then add another level of complexity. And maybe that level of complexity now is a reload. Maybe after it's the reload, you give them, they don't count their rounds. So in a 10-round magazine, maybe, I tell them to stagger the magazine so they never know when that reload's going to come, right? They have to recognize that stimulus and be able to kind of think through it, right? Create a thinker, not a shooter. And then you can keep layering on top of that. And at some point, you will see where the wheels will come off the bus. And that typically is in some sort of lateral movement where they need more repetitions in that. Like we can pick up some of those fundamentals very quickly in the beginning. But then once we start to incorporate movement and or reloads, that's where the wheels will come off the bus. You can create artificial stress. I'm not a fan of like yelling at people on the range. I don't think that's appropriate. You can create artificial stress by introducing a timer, introducing some critical thinking, with numbered and, number or color targets. Like there's multiple ways to, induce stress. Gas mask shooting, right? That's another way to induce stress, or night vision goggles, right? Like you get to those levels of like night vision, you need to have those fundamentals, that movement, that those reloads, et cetera. They need to be, perfect, having done them, hundreds of thousands of times at that point. Like I can't expect somebody that's a new concealed carry owner with 6 months under the belt, to run a, night vision class, so to speak.
That's really interesting you would mention that. So Mike's with us every Monday night, and just last night he mentioned that it took him 10 years of training with nods, live fire, to get to the level he was at when he was Delta Team, which it's absolutely massive. I do a lot of stress inoculation training, and for not everybody in the audience knows this, but I competed on our national powerlifting team for years, set a bunch of world records, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just so busy, George, I don't have time to get to the gym anymore. So what I do is I do band exercises, body weight exercises, I sprint, and I do it all with a rifle. And so my heart rate's 130, 140 beats per minute. And anybody who hasn't trained with an elevated heart rate, you're going to find that unfortunately it's kind of like that guy in Lumberton, North Carolina with the truck jacking sort of thing. But I've got another buddy of mine who's law enforcement in Southern Illinois, George. And he said to me, well, if you want to really simulate the loss of fine motor ability, he said, stick your hands in a bucket of ice for 1 to 2 minutes. He said, I guarantee at 30 seconds, you're going to be screaming to get your hands out of it. He said, and then pull your sidearm or grab your rifle and try hit the targets. And it's a great way of inducing stress. So
yeah, I mean, I always felt I was competent, with rifle and pistol shooting and, probably even gas mask shooting and then like low light, right? I always felt I was pretty competent. And then I took a class at Sig Sauer Academy as a student with night vision, and boy, did I get my lunch handed to me. I was like, I can see how the amount of effort that it takes to get to that, even just a basic operator level, let alone Mike's level. I couldn't even comprehend that, to be honest with you. Like we never operated with night vision. We really didn't have them. But just the ability to be able to do the basic tasks that I felt I had mastered under night vision. Wow. What a difference. What a difference.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way how Mike describes it. He says it's like looking through 2 toilet paper rolls.
So. Yeah. And I had one toilet paper roll at the time. I had a PVS 14. I got, dual tubes now, but
yeah, there you go. So it's interesting. You mentioned gas masks. The people who are part of my Guardians community, which is a paid membership, they know that I train in gas masks in ridiculously hot weather, not frequently because it's claustrophobic like you wouldn't believe. But it's interesting that you would mention that, George, because I've also told a number of our followers, when you put a gas mask on and you get that claustrophobia and then you try to shoot, one of the problems is that a lot of gas masks out there, you can't get a normal cheek weld on a rifle or SBR. And that's one of the reasons I like mirror safety so much, because I've got the CM8 and I got the C21, both of those. I don't have to change my form at all. I get an automatic cheek weld, whereas other ones, I'm doing this sort of stuff, trying to catch a sight window. So kudos to Roman at Mirror for coming up with that. Let me ask you another question.
I'll hit you one thing on there. Obviously, thank you for that. We're very proud of our gas mask. But when you break down what you're doing there, Chris, right? Like when we talk about the fundamentals, right? We want to bring the gun to our head rather than our head to the gun.
Bingo.
And you're experiencing, right, the ability to still maintain that typical fundamental body up straight, where I don't have to, manipulate my body in order to fit the equipment, right? So maintaining that fundamental of bringing the gun to my head rather than my head to the gun, that's where we start to see people that, maybe don't understand the whole, just the basic parts of a firearm, and they'll, I like this gun with this optic or this flashlight, and I'll manipulate my hand position so I can use that. And I think that's the wrong way to kind of go about it, where, you've got to, make the equipment fit you, right? Find the right equipment that fits you, and then continue to work on those fundamentals so that you can execute them flawlessly, and then flawlessly under pressure, if need be.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, we get asked a lot at Survival Dispatch, what do you recommend for a pistol for this person, the other? And I said, I don't recommend any of them. I recommend that you go and try a whole bunch of different ones to find out what works best for you. Anybody who says that a pistol or a rifle can't make you a better shooter is full of shit. I've got a staccato, a full-size staccato, and yeah, it's a Gucci gun. But I'll tell you what, I'm blind in my left eye. That's a prosthetic eye. And I went blind in this eye a couple years ago, just like that, and had to have emergency surgery. And I can shoot better with that staccato than any other pistol. And every single person, with the exception of one person that I've given it to shoot, they're like, man, this thing's a dream. It's so accurate. So, I'll take that over my Glock 19 any day. Put it that way.
Yeah, it's definitely a beautiful gun, right? Like that. I think that gun almost, shoots itself. Like I've been a Glock operator my whole, career. And I have a couple of, based on working with Sig Sauer, et cetera. When I was doing some stuff with them up there, I had some, nice ones from there, and they're beautiful. But again, at the end of the day, if you're a new shooter, like, I hate when I hear people say to me, "Oh, my brother-in-law is a cop and they're a state police, or they were in the army and they said I should get this gun." Stop right there. No, right? Like, the gun needs to fit in your hand. It has to fit in your hand appropriately. And then you got to determine, what are you using that gun for? Is it concealed carry? Is it home defense? Is it marksmanship shooting, right? Like, all these different things have to pay. You got to kind of pay attention to that, where you can't just make a blanket statement and say, you need to get, a Sig Sauer 365 or a Glock 19, or like, it just doesn't work that way. And I think that's where new people get confused, is they want to make the best decision for themselves, and they ask people that they trust their advice, and that person's giving them the best advice they can. However, at the end of the day, if we pay attention to our fundamentals, first and foremost, that gun needs to fit in your hand, and it needs to fit in your hand so you can manage recoil appropriately, period.
Yeah, well, I like to say to people, 2 + 2 = 4. There's an absolute for you.
Right.
But there's very few absolutes in life. Pareto's principle comes into be a factor of most things, the 80-20 rule. I could tell you how I trained for years and set world records. 80% of what I tell you is going to work for you, but the other 20%, which is the hardest part, you got to kind of figure out on your own, right? Same thing with guns. So we discuss the 9/11 2.0 threat, on a regular basis. And I just want to get back to some of your advice here. What's the single most important thing that a family can pre-decide, like right now, that would improve their first 5 minutes of, their survival chances in the first 5 minutes? They're close enough to the X that they survive, but they're close enough to the X that they could be caught in secondary and tertiary attacks.
So it's a great question, right? And I'll break this down to when I was a kid, living at home, as a young kid, and it was having that emergency action plan. And it's very simple, and I'll prove it to you. That how many of you, in the audience might have a kid, and you go to the mall and you ever say to your kid, "Hey, if we get lost or separated, meet me at your favorite toy store, which is X." Or you turn around and say, "My father used to say to us as a kid, hey, if the house is ever on fire, we're going to meet on the steps of Johnny's across the street so nobody goes back in," right? It's having that plan beforehand and then rehearsing that plan. And I think a lot of people, and I think you even said it, Chris, was, people are thinking about, the biggest catastrophe they can and how to survive that. But the reality is probability versus possibility. And we're talking about principles, right? And the principles can be applied where, if it's an environmental emergency, if it's a catastrophic emergency based on, a train car flipping over with chlorine in it, or it's some sort of a mass homicide style event, right? Having those principles, and then knowing that where communication breaks down, that's where the biggest part is, right? Like, if you've ever been on a plane before, and you see the flight attendant doing this, right? They're telling you where the exits are. They're giving you a plan before there's an emergency that takes place, right? So recognizing an emergency is taking place and then implementing, let's get out of here, but we need to know where we're going.
Yeah, so let's just talk principles for a second. So as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, first and foremost, distance equals safety. But give me a rundown of whatever 3 or 4 things that, principles that people need to train, get their head wrapped around when that initial shock hits, and try to avoid going into condition black, basically.
Yeah. So again, recognize the emergency. Don't be in denial. Number two, get off of the X quickly, and depending on what that is, can you get off the X, right? Like if you're in some sort of a, an active shooter, active killer style event, right? You go back to that, depending on the acronym that you prefer: run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, avoid, barricade, confront, right? Can you evacuate safely? And if you can't, what is the alternative to that? And then I always like to say that it's some people don't think about it, but what are your on-scene resources? Okay. Like if you're in, if it's an earthquake, and you're in a supermarket, and there's people that are injured, where are the helpers, right? Who are the doctors, the nurses, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, anybody, lifeguards, right? Who are your on-scene resources? Who are your firefighters? Who are your police officers? Who are your veterans that, might have some combat life-saving, skills. So recognize the emergency, get off the X if you can, recognize your on-scene resources, and then establish appropriate communication to, your family, to where that rally point is going to be. Right. And then we can start to figure out some other pieces of the puzzle from there.
That's awesome advice, George. I appreciate that. So again, we kind of went off of the brief, but I'll reel us back in here. We're going to go into segment number 2 now. And this is an interesting topic that'll be great for George to dive into. It's high probability versus high consequence, the two totally different types of scenarios, and how to prioritize the right threats. So most Americans are mentally preparing for the most terrifying scenario they can imagine rather than the most likely one to actually affect their household. And that mismatch burns resources and leaves real gaps unaddressed. So high consequence events would be like coordinated infrastructure attacks. It's a real threat, but the high probability events like active shooters, medical emergencies, civil disturbances, peaceful protests, those are more likely to happen. That's more likely that people who live in urban environments would face that sort of stuff. So intelligent threat prioritization means building your readiness, from the most likely outward as opposed to the least likely outward. And, there's discipline involved there to separate, the prepared family versus the panic family. And to be honest with you, this is exactly why I built the Guardians Network: real people, real-time alerts, and direct communication. So you're not trying to figure this stuff out alone, pardon me, by yourself. So George, when you're training people now, how do you teach a civilian to distinguish between a high probability threat they should plan for versus a high consequence threat that is dominating their attention? Because let's say there was a terrorist attack in the next city over, sort of thing. Obviously, that's going to be top of mind. We talk a lot about terrorist attacks, but realistically in America, it's still not a regular event.
Yeah. So I'm going to segue into that with, again, another little anecdote here. And, pick any elementary school in the town where you live, Chris, and I'll let you pick. And we can go from first grade through 8th grade. And let's walk into that classroom and we yell lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. Okay. What do we expect that first grader, that second grader is going to do? They're going to go into the teacher's going to lock the door, and then the kids are going to go into the corner they've been told to go into. Now, on the flip side, if you're an adult and I go into your house of worship or I go into your workplace and I yell lockdown, 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 what's going to happen? Okay. Probably nothing, because you haven't trained in it before. And is it because the second graders are smarter than the adult? Is it because they're more physically capable than the adult? The answer is no. The answer is lies in the fact that they've prepared for it before. So, although, and very fortunately, right, those mass shooter style events, although we do have some in the United States, they're not likely to hit everybody, fortunately. Okay. But the principles remain the same as far as, an environmental emergency where we lose power because of a storm, and you're able to be resilient, and we can define what resilience is. But, once that first, again, we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about a more finite, shorter term event versus something that's a little bit longer. But again, it all boils down to, that mental exercise and how they've prepared rather than being the ostrich burying their head in the sand. And it's not because second graders are smarter. It's because they have an awareness of what they're supposed to do in the emergency.
Yeah, once again, great advice, George. So let's talk a little bit of, CBRM, so chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and you were involved in that when you were special operations in the NYPD, but of course, that's a big focus for mirror safety. What do you reckon the most underestimated everyday threats there are from a CBRN perspective?
Clearly, in my opinion, that's due to some sort of a transportation disaster or an accidental chemical leak, right? So, if we break those things down into, when I would teach this topic, right, we look at, chemical warfare, chemical attack, or chemical accident. I'm not very concerned that, some nefarious state is going to lob a 155 millimeter mustard round into lower Manhattan, right? Like, I think the likelihood of that is pretty slim. A chemical attack, is that possible? Potentially, and those are based on things. If you look back at some, we did have recent ones. I'll talk about that in a second. But like Tokyo Sarin subway, right? That's a great case study. But a chemical accident where there's no nefarious intent, but it causes you to either have to shelter in place or that you've got to, evacuate or bug out. So, and it's very interesting to me that we had two recent ones and they don't get the attention. And I think it's because they don't want to draw much attention to it. But if we look at the Ilhan Omar, I think it was acetic acid or vinegar or something that she had thrown on her, right? At the end of the day, the reality of that, it's a very, very mild toxic industrial chemical. We won't get into the details behind it, why we thought it happened or whatever, right? But that is a chemical attack. A chemical accident would be like a train derailment or like Conyers, Georgia, where that plant starts to have a chemical leak and a spill, or, Palestine, Ohio, where that, train cars flip over, right? So the reality is, I think we're more susceptible to what would be a chemical accident versus an intentional chemical attack. We saw another one too, at the Kennedy Center, right? And I've been digging into that one because I'm trying to figure out what was going on there. But the Kennedy Center, and the quote, there was a toxic industrial chemical that was poured into the ice skating rink at the Kennedy Center. And that's all they said about it. I'm very curious to know what that chemical was. And again, a lot of these things are easily obtainable at, your home supply store.
Yeah, I mean, that's scary stuff. And it's kind of funny you would mention the Tokyo subway deal. I think that was like 96 or something, where the attackers unleashed sarin gas. And for those of you who aren't familiar, sarin gas, it's a nerve gas. It dissipates really fast outside, but inside it doesn't. And once you're exposed to it, it could go subcutaneous through your skin. You could breathe it in. You can actually, the worst spot is through your eyes. You got 3 minutes and you're dead. It basically scrambles your central nervous system. Go ahead, George.
Yeah. So I want to bring up again, a teaching point for that was, so as a civilian, they were riding the train. Okay. The people going to work, I think it was the morning rush hour, whatever it was. And that group releases sarin gas, and the civil defense for Tokyo was in denial. They did not react appropriately for 3 hours. That's a fact.
Wow.
Okay. That they did not initiate a decon process for 3 hours. So what did that mean? That meant people were affected, and they got on a different train and they cross-contaminated people. They went to work and cross-contaminated people. They went to hospitals on their own without being brought there, and they contaminated hospitals, right? So, like, again, heaven forbid you're in a scenario like that, right? Time and distance certainly, would be life preserving, right? But then again, don't contaminate yourself, meaning if I think I got it on my hands and I don't rub my eyes, or can I remove layers of clothing to remove some of that contamination, right? So a lot of those things kind of, come into play, and it always boils down to, situational awareness. I'm not expecting people to have, my knowledge or people that have even greater knowledge than mine. There's plenty of those. But recognize the emergency is taking place and say this is unusual based on odor, sights, smells, and the way people are reacting to what's going on. We expect people to run away in hysteria, but if they've got that, we throw out that acronym sludgeon, that they're tearing, or they're defecating themselves, or they're vomiting, right? Like that's unusual. We start to see multiple people doing that. That's very, very unusual.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a scenario that actually comes out of real world intelligence that Khalid Mohammed brought to us. I want to say maybe 9 months ago or so. Then that this came out of a terrorist training camp in Afghanistan. So when Saddam Hussein was taken out, he had a huge stockpile of sarin gas. And my understanding is that we did capture some of it, but a lot of it found its way to other countries in the Middle East. And the intel that Khalid brought to us said that when these sleeper cells attack soft targets like a school, for example, they had plans to show up dressed like HVAC technicians in an HVAC van, and 2 of them get out, but there's more inside. And the van is loaded up with a VBIED, so a vehicle-borne IED. They get out, they put a ladder against the school, they go up on the roof, they cut the ductwork, they put these, timed sarin release canisters in the ductwork. They put the metal back on, duct tape it to seal it up, and they get down. A few minutes later, it goes off. What SOP is there for that, George? Like, I mean, it seems to me that the majority of people are in deep, deep trouble.
100%, right? Like, and again, I've said it before, right? Know what normal looks like, right? And a lot of people aren't going to call into question, when they see an HVAC person. That's kind of, normal day-to-day life, right?
Yeah.
If you're a softer target, and I see this happening a lot in, let's call it the house of worship, especially with the Jewish community. They've gotten a lot better to question things that even look normal, right? So if you're a softer target like that, it's not out of place for a security agent or a security guard to say, hey, who are you here with, right? Just give them that 1 or 2 challenging questions, without being assumptive. But like, hey, what company do you work for? And I don't have you on my schedule for today. When knowing in the back of your head you have no schedule, but you challenge them not the first time. And I've learned this, from the synagogue community. They challenge them the second time. So we saw that happen. Actually, that your friend brought it up, as a possible attack. We saw that happen with the Russians, and they used a pharmaceutical based agent. It was the Chechen, the theater.
Theater, yeah, 2002 Chechen rebels.
But and what they did, right, that in a hostage crisis, it came out that they used a pharmaceutical based agent, i.e. carfentanil, and they basically overdosed everybody. They tried to put them to sleep, but they ended up overdosing everybody, and killed them, right? And how they do that? Through the HVAC system. So it's, again, like you need a little bit more knowledge to be able to execute some sort of a plan like that, rather than just take, heaven forbid, a U-Haul truck and drive it down the West Side Highway like some knucklehead did, years ago, right? Like there's a little bit more involved in that. And I would think there's probably some more tells in people trying to plan something like that, but just the way my brain works in the space that I am in right now with Mira is, how do we mitigate that type of thing for, not only agencies, but civilians?
Yeah, so just a couple quick things, because you mentioned that Chechen hostage situation at the theater in downtown Moscow. I reference it frequently because, unlike you guys, like, what's an acceptable loss of life in a hostage situation for the NYPD?
Oh, be 0.
Correct.
Right? Not the military, right? Like we're clearly not it's a 2 completely different worlds. To us, it's 0. Right, like the old acronym going back. I started. You see, you want to talk there, but right, SWAT now really stands for sit, wait, and talk. Right, they surround homes more now as an SOP. I'm long gone at this point, but that's more of a tactic. And again, I'm very fortunate with what I've done since I've retired to be exposed to different, not only agencies but ministries of defense, Department of Defense. And a tactic that I'm seeing emerging more in the law enforcement space is, as they surround a house and they'll do a surround and call out. Sometimes they'll introduce gas into that house, rather than sending operators inside, or they'll use a drone, et cetera, right? So more so I've heard it more on the small to mid-sized agencies as a tactic. I'm not aware of the NYPD, using it, or maybe some of the large agencies, but I'm gone a couple of years. But if you look at the use of drones, even like the tier one guys, they're using more. Don't put people on a target. Like if we can do that, and save our lives, in essence, it saves a lot more lives as well.
Well, I mean, the reason I asked you that question is because the FSB, which is the Russian equivalent to the FBI, if 50% of the hostages die, oh, well, like that's an acceptable death count. They're so
zero. The acceptable loss is zero.
Yeah, they're so opposite us. And it's funny you should mention that carfentanil as well. As you know, but not everybody knows, there's 1,400 different analogs of fentanyl. We have signatures on about 200 of them. And carfentanil, remifentanil is another one that are about 50 times more powerful than the base analog of fentanyl. So not only did the FSB pump aerosolized carfentanil into that HVAC system, they didn't tell anybody. So, so the people who died could have been saved by first responders with Narcan. But I mean, now that I mentioned that, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, 80% of the fentanyl seized in America last year was laced with xylazine, which is a horse tranquilizer, and Narcan will not do a dang thing. You get hit, you get hit with xylazine, you're dead. I mean, it will literally shut your entire body down. But yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we did an episode about 4.5 years ago on some intel that we got that the jihadis wanted to use aerosolized fentanyl distributed by drones at low altitude over top of a crowd at a football game, concert, whatever the case may be. It's a brutal deal. And even if it didn't kill a lot of people and it evaporated, the fear factor would be clearly off the chain. I got a question for you here, George. So there was some intel that came out. It was open source intel. This didn't come from one of our other sources. This was maybe going back 2 months ago or so. That was a heads up to people, because what you described, the normalcy bias. Is it normal? Is it not normal? Well, how many days a week is Amazon at your house, George?
Oh my goodness. I think they're here. I had 3 different delivery trucks here today, personally. I was at Amazon, UPS, FedEx, and believe it or not, Yelp delivered something from Best Buy today. I didn't know Yelp even delivered.
Yeah, that's news to me as well. So put this into your calculus and tell me what your thoughts are. That intelligence basically said that these jihadi bad guys are dressed up as Amazon delivery people. And I don't know about New York, but here in Florida, Amazon's so busy. A lot of times it's a person driving their own private vehicle. It's not the Amazon vans, right? But they still have the Amazon smock on, so on and so forth. That these guys are watching Amazon come into your neighborhood and deliver boxes at your front door. And then they go and grab the box and they leave a new box. And the new box is full of explosives that triggers when you pick the box up. And, it's not anything fancy. It doesn't have like aerosolized fentanyl or anything. It's a kinetic bomb that goes off. There were other pieces of intel from somebody else that basically said, in many instances, they're not even waiting to take the box. They just come to your door and they leave a box at your front door, whether you ordered it or not. And people think, oh, well, my wife must have ordered something from Amazon. I'm not expecting it. They pick it up, poof, gone. Just give me your thoughts on that one, George. It's pretty horrific.
So I haven't heard that yet, right? But if we kind of dissect that, it almost sounds like the old, burning bag of dog poop, on somebody's lawn. Like, of course, I never did that as a kid, right? But, we can sit here and say that we can be situationally aware and we can look for things that are out of the normal, et cetera, the color codes of awareness, et cetera. How, and again, like I'll tie it back to this analogy. I have an alarm system on my house and signs, beware of the dog, ADT security, video cameras, et cetera. These layered, tells, so to speak. And I ask people who has an alarm on their house, and people will raise their hand. I say, why? Why do you have one? And they say, well, for protection or for this or for that. I say, that's not the reason why. The reason why that I have one is because my neighbors don't. So we're looking at people. If we're looking at a target, you're going to pick the easier target. However, in this Amazon spot where you are clearly the target, I don't think there's much that you're going to be able to do, right? Like they picked you for a reason. Maybe it was random and they picked you, or you're the target of something. And if that's the case, that is a very, very difficult thing to protect against.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of, and they addressed it in the second piece of intel that we got, is that if they come and drop a box on your porch and you didn't order anything, and there's other people in the household, you should ask your wife maybe, hey, are you expecting something from Amazon? And if neither party's expecting something from Amazon and you look at the label and it's, it doesn't jive, well, yeah, maybe you call 911 in that case. But if they're replacing a box that you were expecting that day, I have no idea how to.
Again, like you're the target for whatever reason. That's very, very difficult to defend against, But again, the practicality of that is, I'm a family of 4 other people that have a couple people in the household. There's an Amazon truck here almost daily, so it's almost, we would be exhausted asking if, did you order something? And like, no, I didn't. It's like, again, we hop in Amazon and like, depending on who ordered last, that's whose name comes on the package, even though my wife ordered something.
Right.
It's very, in my opinion, very, very difficult to protect against that.
So the context that George I forgot to lay the groundwork to that was, if and when we have CCTAs, complex coordinated terrorist attacks, that's part of the secondary and tertiary plans where they're going into residential neighborhoods to terrorize Americans, where they live, and not just in downtown cores and centers. The other interesting thing about you bringing up Japan, by the way, and Sarah and Michael Yan, I don't know if you know, he is former Green Beret. He's very, very well known. He's in Japan right now. We've been going back and forth for about a month to get him on Survival Dispatch News, but they're completely opposite time zone to ours, but he's a phenomenal guy. Happy to introduce you to him as well. Let's go back to CBRN for a second here. Where does CBRN fit on the probability consequence spectrum for the average American? It's like 1 to 10, like 1 being the most likely, 10 being the least likely.
I think we're probably in a 4 to 5 realm. And I think you could either be higher on that or you could be lower on that, right? We're somewhere in the middle. We like to say, you could last 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air. So we do prioritize, the ability to breathe very, very high. I think for a normal American family, I am making a list, right? We'll have a free resource download, tier A, tier B, tier C, and then an honorable mentions about, preparedness. I will put, gas masks and filters in the A category for sure.
Okay.
But, if you think about, if you're living in, backwoods Montana somewhere, potentially, that would be a safe zone for other people. But I think the vast majority of us could really fall into that realm of, it's something that should be in the tier A list, in the top couple, water being another one of them, and the ability to create fire is another one for me.
Well, just a quick mask question, and it's not specific to Mira. What's the usage scenario for the half masks? So in other words, you don't have any protection on your eyes, but nose and mouth.
I think there's a couple of different things you can use for that, right? Like if you're talking about dust particles and you've got some sort of eye protection over it, like, shooting glasses or goggles. We're not so much worried about a splash hazard. We're not so much worried. Again, the filter is going to determine a lot of it. And you got to kind of know what you're going to be going up against. I don't want to make this kind of like an SOP, but if you're EMS, and you're potentially working with, somebody that's, has, overdose from fentanyl, that could be a scenario kind of thing. There's multiple, but I don't want to get too narrow and make people think that that's the only way to use it as far as an SOP, like, it's fentanyl or it's, chlorine or something along those lines. But at the end of the day, my choice is going to be a full face, respirator, because again, you just don't know what the threat's going to be. And I'd rather have a little bit additional protection. I think, to be honest with you, like as far as our products are concerned, our entry level mask is is relatively inexpensive. It's not much more than the half face respirator. So I think the half face respirator gives you a little bit more of a tactical, in that
Right.
scenario. But I'm gonna defer to an entry level mask, right off the bat, just because you don't know what is coming next. So I'd rather just protect from that vantage point.
Well, I mean, that's a good direction to go here. How do you help people who are like overwhelmed by all of this stuff? I mean, when they start hearing about the different threats that we're facing and they've lived their entire lives outsourcing their safety to you guys, on the thin blue line, what matters? Like, what's important to teach those people without freaking them out completely, or them also saying, "Oh yeah, bullshit, that ain't gonna happen." Where's that
So
demarcation?
there's definitely a difference between preparedness and paranoia. I'm sure your SF friends and those guys are, I learned it from them, right? Regardless of how good my position is, I'm always looking to improve my position, right? Whether it be tactically, medically, you put a bandage on somebody, for a minor wound, like, hey, is it soaking through? Is it, and keep looking how to improve upon that. So based on that, again, concept, what I would say to people that are newer in the space, you have to start somewhere. And it's something that I kind of recognized when I took on this role for Mira. And we do a lot of videos on that, but we're going to have a checklist on the website. And again, there's suggestions, and I want to break them down for where people to start, but it could be very simple. It's like, just think about the next, environmental emergency that you have, a power outage, right? We're used to, in the United States, power coming back on in roughly 24 hours. Maybe it's 36. If it goes 48 or 72, people start to become people, and they don't display the resilience, meaning they're not really kind of able to, they might not have enough food in their house to feed a family of four, right? So you buy a couple of non-perishable things, cans of beans or something along those lines, right? Where if there's some sort of an emergency, you start to kind of stockpile things a little bit. And I want to say that very carefully, right? Like, I'm not saying that you need a Connex box in back of your house, with all sorts of things in it, but think about what the primary needs of your family is, whether they be, if you have a special needs child, or you have a pet, or you take blood pressure medication, like, what does 7 days without power look like for you, and start there.
Yeah, good point. I mean, we're a first world country with a third world power grid. Um, and again, we're on this Japanese thing. I'm a big fan of Kaizen, which is a Japanese term for continuous improvement, which was essentially what you were describing. The food supply chain right now is fragile, and we always tell people, George, to pay attention to what's going on in other Western countries, because it's a harbinger of things to come here, with almost 100% accuracy. The reports of food prices in the UK today, you're talking $3 items all of a sudden $25.
Wow.
And that's not an exaggeration. That's coming here. And I'm going to give our friends at Carnival a shameless plug here. I don't know if you've heard of these guys or not, but they cracked the nut on freeze drying meat with a 25-year shelf life. Normally, when you get freeze dried meat, it's been cooked, then freeze dried, saturated in sodium. And when you heat it up, you're cooking it another time. It's like eating shoe leather. That's raw meat, and it's 100% American. I'm telling you right now, for everybody out there, depending on what your budget is, if you can afford to stock up on Carnival, do it. Use code EATMEAT to get 10% off. We don't make any affiliate money, by the way, off of Carnival. They pay us a stipend that helps us defer our expenses. But anyway, moving on from there, George, what do you think the most dangerous preparedness blind spot is for the average American today?
I have to go back to denial. I think for me, it's hands down, it's denial. They just, how can we say it with kind of, try to not offend people? There's a segment of the population that just feels nothing is ever going to go wrong. So my wife and I kind of balance each other in that. She's all kind of, sunshine and rainbows, but I've spent my whole life mitigating risk. So I'm always kind of thinking about one step ahead about, what's next, what happens when this goes wrong, so kind of like that medium in there. But just having some sort of a plan, I think people that are just thinking that, the government is going to take care of themselves, or it's just going to kind of work itself out. I'm just not of that mindset where I'm going to leave. I'm responsible for the safety and security of 3 people in this house. Like, I'm not going to leave it up to some other entity, because what if that entity is busy? What if they, we triage things and they prioritize other things? And, yes, I'm my number one priority in my house, but there could be other things that need to be taken care of from those resources. Right. So, there are people way more prepared than I am. Right. I feel I'm in a pretty decent shape, for that. But, I remember I was telling somebody the story recently that if we go back to, Y2K in 1999, and we thought everything was going to shut down.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of I was a rookie cop at the time. And I was like, well, how do I make water? I didn't even know. So I remember buying a couple of water bottles that had like charcoal filters in it, like from the local camping store. Would I make that purchase today? No. Right. But what I did was, in my brain, was say to myself, I'm going to start to become resilient, because I don't want to be a burden on somebody else. I may not have the knowledge that everybody else has. And there are plenty more people that have more knowledge than you and I, but I'm going to do the best of my ability. And then again, when I feel comfortable and competent there, how do I raise that standard, right? How do I make it a little bit better now and a little bit better? And that might just be, starting with water purification and air purification, but being able to not be a complete burden, because we look at people like that, like, you couldn't help yourself at all, man. Like, there's nothing you could do to help yourself. Do something to help yourself. Do something to help your family.
Good advice, George. Good advice. What was the head count at the NYPD when you left, George?
At its height in my career, we were at 42,000. When I left, I want to say it was between 36 and 38,000. I think it's about 36 now. And they've kind of reduced the size by not putting in as many classes. And again, we could go down rabbit holes about the reason why behind that, but I will say, I look back, would I do it all over again? Yes, I loved it. I loved doing what I did. I think there was a lot of benefit that came out of it for me. I had a very, fruitful career. But they've downsized it over the last handful of years. And I think there are a lot of factors that kind of go into that.
Yeah, so I read somewhere that the optimum head count for NYPD was around 50,000, and like most law enforcement across the country, they're operating at a reduced number of what the optimum number would be. And then, of course, you have the post 2020 cops, like, Acorn Cop here in Florida, right? And so is 50,000 a good number for New York, George? There's a reason I'm getting to, but I just want to hear your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, at 40 to 42,000, we were pretty well staffed. I'm not a logistics guy, on the inside. That was never my career. 42,000 there was a lot of us, and I would say when I first started, in 0.9 square miles of senseless violence, we had 350 cops. Okay.
Wow.
And that was just a precinct. That wasn't specialty units that would come in, et cetera. And the reason why it got to 40 and 42,000, I think those were like old Bill Clinton, anti-crime reduction laws and federal funding. They had to hire, people kind of along that spectrum. But again, there's less and less people that want to become police officers for whatever reason now. There's multiple. But at 40,000, 42,000, that was significant. What I can say factually is I still have friends that are on the police department. And 35,000 doesn't seem like enough to me, because there are people that can't get days off when they're regularly scheduled off, and that really starts to spiral multiple things out of control for everybody, families, their physical well-being, their mental well-being. People are getting stuck, forced to be overtime when they want to go, like when I joined, I knew, we weren't going to get days off Christmas and New Year and blah, blah, blah. But, a random Tuesday in April, you can't get off because there's not enough manpower. Something needs to change.
Yeah, well, I see Ma'am Dammy saying he's going to cut 5,000 more from the head count and take NYPD down to 30,000. But here's where I was going with all of that. And we frequently tell people, you are your own first responder. Just out of curiosity, an average, I don't expect it to be, dead nuts, but what was the average response time when you had a contingent of 42,000 versus the average response time today? Best guess.
So again, if we go back to when I first started, in the late 90s, and 0.9 square miles, again, it could vary. And I think there's a lot of people across the country in law enforcement that just never really kind of understands police departments of that size, right? Your LAs, your Chicago's, your Miamis, et cetera. And, we would go out with 12 or 14 sector cars in 0.9 square miles. And each one of those cars could handle 20. It was very usual to handle 20 to 30 radio runs in a night. So I could be holding 5 or 8, and you're prioritizing them based on, shots fired, robberies in progress, burglaries in progress, et cetera. So like your car accidents, we didn't get to those right away. And I think now, if that same thing holds true and you have less officers, but the call volume remains the same, and you could probably look this up via CompStat, but that call volume remains the same or even close to what it was, back then, it's just not reasonable. And again, like if you're a citizen and you call 911 in the United States of America, I expect somebody to show up there. On their worst day, whether it be fire, EMS, or law enforcement, they call 911 because it is their worst day, and it's unfortunate that, for police, I know they go to everything, right? Anytime anybody in New York City calls 911, could be my son fell down the stairs and stubbed his toe. I need an ambulance. The police have to go to that to determine if there was criminality involved. That's one of the things that leads to the friction, I think, when people, dislike law enforcement, because they have to prioritize and triage different call volumes and different types of things that come in. So my guess is going to be if Mondamini wants to reduce that, I'm not an expert on this, but he talks a lot about having NYPD not respond to certain types of calls. But it just doesn't work in the real world. It doesn't work. Like it might, maybe on paper, if you're a scholar, let's try it as an experiment. But in my opinion, citizens' lives of any community, are not a criminal justice class. We can determine this on paper, right? So one of the things that he wants to do is, not send law enforcement to, emotionally disturbed people. And I know that's a bad, I think can't even say that anymore, but, they want to send a social worker. But the reality is, more often than not behind that, it's a very unpredictable situation. And you need somebody with, law enforcement power, physicality, et cetera, to be able to, mitigate that outcome. And I don't want to see here the sky is falling that, social workers are going to get killed. It's certainly possible, but they're not equipped. And I understand the flip side of the argument, right? When you're trained like a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I get it. But, just because, you're going to send a social worker there, that I think it can be effective sometimes, but there's going to be 8 out of 10 times where it's just not going to be effective. And my assumption is going to be they're going to reduce headcounts and they're going to take responsibilities away from law enforcement. But the reality, again, is we see they end up with more and more and more responsibility. We just saw it with the Gracie Mansion incident where the pipe bomb came out, right? The strategic response group and the whole, that's the riot control part of the NYPD. Like he wants to disband that for their tactics, et cetera. Like, who are you going to use? Who are you going to send? I don't get it.
Yeah, let me just pull something up here, George. I want to get your opinion on this before we go into the final segment. So this was the Temple Israel shooting in Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see there's dozens of law enforcement vehicles. There is very specific intelligence amongst jihadis where they plan on this happening, right? So like Mumbai in 2008, they would attack and then they would sit and wait for the first responders. And then when the first responders showed up, they would hit them with a secondary and tertiary attack. Yep. And they want to do that here as well. And I know multiple people in law enforcement, and they've all said the same thing, that they all have SOPs to avoid this, but it never gets followed through on. Why is that, George? I mean, I'm assuming that NYPD had, the same type of deal where don't all pile up on top of each other, but it seems like it happens every time.
Yeah, so that's drilled into us, from the academy and moving forward, et cetera, right? And that's I'm sure it happened long before the incident that I remember. And I won't mention those animals' names, right? But that goes back to Columbine, that they those animals placed IEDs in trash cans because they knew where law enforcement was going to marshal, right? And those
Mhm.
explosive devices never went off, right? So that goes back to 20 or 30 years ago at this point. So that's drilled into your head pretty good, But at the end of the day, everybody there wants to help, and they get there, and you look at that, and that was something again in my little precinct, way back when, that you go to somebody yelling for an emergency over the radio because you got to go help them. You've also got to factor in the fact that I need to get an ambulance through there, multiple ambulances through there, and those ambulances need to be able to get out of there, right? So that traffic jam that you cause, it's a problem for many, 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 many reasons. And then factor in normal traffic in a big Chicago and LA and New York and Miami, that is a compounding problem.
Yeah, it sure is. So let's get into the third and final segment here, George. I really appreciate your time, by the way.
Thank you. I love it.
So the final segment is layered home and family readiness, communication plans, and situational awareness. So a communication plan that only exists in someone's head is not really a plan. It's a wish, and wishes don't typically survive the first 5 minutes of a real incident when phones are down and family members are in different locations. So layered readiness means every member of your household knows 2 rally points, 2 out of area contact numbers, and the protocol when regular communications fail. And a good piece of advice somebody gave me years ago is keep the stuff written down on a piece of paper in your vehicle. So even if you're in that high stress and you don't remember it, you've got some dead tree format to come back to. And then situational awareness, it's not like a skill that you turn on during an emergency. It's a habit, right? It's a daily thing that you do. So I used to like working as a doorman when I was younger. There were reasons for it. I didn't really need the money, but I enjoyed the job. And ever since then, I've been sucker punched from behind, stools busted over my head from behind. It doesn't matter where we go. I'm sitting with my back against the wall and watching everything that comes in through the front door. So that's just an example of situational awareness. And at the end of the day, on this topic, again, it's something that you practice regularly. And our survival dispatch guardians community, they get direct access to all of us. And that's a great place to learn each of the steps to improve your situational awareness, because everybody's kind of at different points, different skill sets, different levels of situational awareness. So George, what does a realistic paper-based family comms plan look like? And are there anything that in your mind is just like non-negotiable? Like you got to have this as part of your comms plan?
So again, I think I've said that, I feel pretty competent and comfortable, but there's always something to learn. And what I learned from you, Chris, was when I was reading the notes today about, the paper in the car, right? I thought that was a really great touch, to do that. For me, non-negotiable, I would say I started with my kids at a very, very young age. If we would go to the supermarket or to the movies, first and foremost, I taught them where exits were, right? Look for an emergency exit. And you can think back to the Aurora incident where that animal, used smoke to distract people and funnel them into a certain area, right? So having the ability to know where exits are is non-negotiable to me, right? No matter where you go, I could look at one of my kids right now and say, just give them the look and they're going to point out exits for me, right? That's just drilled in, and that's just normal safety. Like, what if the building goes on fire? You got to be able to get out of it. Again, second is, where are people going to rally? That's a non-negotiable to me. And based on if it's, in a mall when they were younger, or now based in the house, or heaven forbid, it's something a larger scale that we know where we're going to go to my parents who live, further away in the mountains, where we have more resources off the beaten path, to be able to do that. So I think the one concern that I would have that we could always improve upon is, my kids are the generation of, Waze and Google Maps. I don't think they know the roads as well, but I think thinking about that now putting down the major routes, the I-95s and the, I-4s, so to speak, in Florida. Take I-4 north, figure out how to get to I-4 north, and then, like that kind of thing. I think that would be a critical tool to be able to say, hey, if for whatever reason you lost your phone, not that communications are done, you lost your phone and you have to leave and go to grandma's house. How do you get there? Once you get on the road that you need to go to, then you can kind of, follow the path you've always taken. But what are those roads called? Do they even know? I think that would be a critical piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, we counsel people to have several different ways to get home. The average American works 18 miles from home. And tell me if you've ever encountered this. So Keith Graves, Christian Warrior Training, is a good personal friend of mine. And he was telling me years ago, he said, they have an intersection closed. He was law enforcement, of course. They had an intersection closed because there was a wreck. And invariably somebody would pull up and roll their window down and say, hey, can you let me go through? And he'd say, no, you can't go through. There's been a wreck. And the person turns around and says, well, I don't know how to get home. Like, that's the only way they knew how to get. Did that ever happen? Here's a story.
I'll give you a little bit different, and it'll be a funny story. You'll get a kick out of it. I remember doing the presidential detail one day in Manhattan a handful of years ago, and we got to shut down the roads when the caravan would come down with the president and stuff like that. And one of the Manhattanites, we've got it's frozen now, right? Nobody can walk across the street. It's frozen because the vehicles are coming. And the woman was adamant about, I have to get home. I have to get home. I need to go now. Like, you can't go. You're not allowed to go. Well, I don't care. I need to go. So I turned around and I looked at her and I said, you know what? I'm going to stop the president and the motorcade for you. So and I started like I was doing it was far enough away that it wasn't going to happen. But then she kind of called me a, you know what? And then she kind of got it. But, it's just those people that don't take into account the other things that are going on around them, and they're the most important thing in their world, right? And I get that, but there are other important things that are going on as well that might affect your ability to do what it is that you want to do.
Yeah, good answer. So again, I have no affiliation with these guys, but I love their products. So Mad Gear Company, and this is their contingency planner. And it's got all kinds of really cool stuff in it. Like, I'll just flip to a random page. So, for example, it's all fill in the blanks essentially, and then you can get more sophisticated. For those of you who heard Jeff mention one-time pads last night, they've actually got one here. Let me see where it went. Here it is, right there. So this is what a one-time pad looks like. For those of you, we were discussing it last night. So in other words, you can have those numbers equal those letters. So somebody, gives you a string of numbers and you can decode it one time with your one-time pad. But Mad Gear Contingency Planner, my desk is covered up in it because I wanted to show you all some of this stuff. Kick-ass tool, because at the end of the day, and I know you agree, George, you either fail the plan. If you fail the plan, you plan to fail at the end of the day.
That's it, right? We were taught, plan your dive and dive your plan. That was it. So, it's the exact same thing, but you have to have a plan, right? And then, we break it down a little bit further, right? You could pace, primary, alternate, contingency, exigency, right? Like, that's the way it was well into my spec ops career before I started kind of realizing that as well. But, having multiple ways to do that, it's not just one way. What happens if, the road is shut down because of a wreck? How do you get to grandma's or something?
Yeah. So pace is all over this Mad Gear stuff. It's truly a contingency planner. It's not very expensive, but they put a ton of thought into this. And again, you can buy all these different pages in whatever quantity that you want or you need. So you spoke about, your kids and making them situationally aware of exits and stuff. Just for the average person, George, how does the average person, they're not getting any training from anybody. They're an adult. What's your recommendation for them on how they can build situational awareness, kind of like a daily habit, as opposed to them being forced into being reactive? Go ahead and take it from there. I got a couple other comments, so I'll wait till you're done.
Yeah, definitely. So there are two ways, right? I'll give you. I'm a story guy, and I like to teach by anecdote. So you're in Florida, and if I said to you, tell me if you see more Miami Dolphins fans or more Florida Marlins fans, how are you going to determine that? Okay, you can determine that by looking at the environment, what baseball hats, what bumper stickers, what jerseys, what sweatshirts, etc., or people are wearing, right? So, like, you can develop situational awareness. You just have to be able to start looking for things. The other thing that I would say is, if you've got kids, I know I've done it. My parents did it to me, and you've used situational awareness to your advantage. And I'll give you a story. So let's say it's, Thanksgiving morning, and you're driving to grandma's house with your 4-year-old and your 6-year-old in the car, and it's going to be a 3-hour car ride, and you're exhausted because you had to wake up early to get there for dinner, and you don't want them to be screaming, crying, whatever. So you use a situational awareness game to your advantage. And that game is, you say to your kids, hey, I want you to find a license plate from Hawaii on a car as we're driving to grandma's. And if you find one, I'm going to give you $20, but there's only one rule. And that rule is you can't talk when you're playing the game, right? So who's played that game with their kids before? I had it played to me, but right, that's it. That's really what situational awareness is, right? Like, you've played it with your kids. I'm probably not the only one that's had that done to them, but that's in reality what it is. So developing your situational awareness, I think, is really one of the top key components of just making your surroundings safe. And we're prepared, not paranoid. And it's just being aware of what goes on around you on a daily basis. I'm sure things slip through the cracks with me. I'm not hyper aware. I'm just aware, right? In my normal day-to-day life, and I guess, like in hunting season, the white-tailed deer, walk around in hunting season in condition orange all the time, right? There, any twig, any crack, any branch, any wind that blows, right? They're hyper alert. I'm just saying to be aware. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I appreciate that, George. Again, I've already been getting messages from people on our Element server saying,
you like it.
hey, George is awesome, and invite him back. So you'll definitely be on my casting call email that I send out. George, I mean, you've seen some calamities at a fairly large scale in New York City. What's the most common communication failure for a family?
For a family, that's a good question. I think for a family, not being aware, but not knowing what to do when it happens, that, if you've got one kid that's doing one thing, you got to control the environment, right? Like, if you got younger kids, control the kids appropriately. Have your wife, control your environment appropriately, meaning, calm is contagious, but so is panic, right? So, like, if you can take that deep breath, and you can put that, okay, we're dealing with this now, it's, what do you want to do in a gunfight? It's the same principles, right? What do you want to do in a gunfight is win. What does win stand for? What's important now? So if you can break things down, take that deep breath, calm is contagious, so is panic, and start to eat the dinosaur one bite at a time. What's important now? Okay, we need to remain in place, or we need to get out of here, or I need to, I can't find my 8-year-old, and it's, the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree lighting, right? What's important now? So breaking things down into those individual components about what's important now, that's the communication piece for me, at least.
All right, so off the script a little bit here, but I'm dying to hear what your answer is. So it's a common tactic amongst jihadi terrorists to have some of their people dressed up as first responders, especially law enforcement officers. It's not unique. They did it on 10/7 in Israel, and the people who looked up and saw the guys coming in by paragliders that were paying attention, they got to the parking lot, they got in their vehicles, they tried to exfil. And a couple Hamas guys dressed up as cops said, well, you can't pass here, it's not safe. And then the other Hamas guys jumped out either side and slaughtered them in their cars. So there's been a ton of law enforcement and first responder uniforms stolen in the past couple of years. And it's every piece of intel on 9/11 2.0 includes that component. So the picture basically being, you've got the jihadis, let's say at the school, they do the first part of the attack, right? They put the sarin nerve gas in the HVAC. what any people who try to get out, they shoot them on the spot, and then they wait for the cops to show up, and they let off their VBIED. But people who are in the vicinity, let's say, who weren't exposed to the sarin inside, like somebody who lives in that particular area, comes out, they're in shock at what they're seeing. And all of a sudden they see what they think is a cop, and normalcy bias kicks in. They think, oh, thank God, the cavalry's here. And in reality, it's not the cavalry. What's your advice on how people should handle it? Myself, I'm not as sophisticated as you are. I just tell people, get as far away as fast as you can. Don't trust a dang person that you see. But I'm sure you've got some additional insight.
Yeah, that's a real tough one, and I became aware of that shortly after 9/11 when you got the first intel report that an ambulance was missing, right? An ambulance was missing when EMT here. You're like, oh my goodness, right? I remember it way back then. It's been going on at least since then and probably before that. I think also you can look at, just look at social media. How many different, AI bots or, influencer girls are wearing some sort of police uniform acting provocative, and it even catches me like, wait a second, is that a real police officer? And it takes me a second to recognize maybe there's a piece of uniform that's out of place. I think it's almost impossible for somebody as a civilian to kind of recognize that. Again, like if we're that complex of an incident or an attack, hopefully you've recognized signs earlier than that in that yellow and orange state before it gets to red, right? That's the only way that you're going to be able to mitigate that potentially without really saying, without resetting that OODA loop over and over again. Is that a real uniform or not? Because even I'm going to get confused having worn that one uniform for 2 decades, and that's not a state police uniform that I never wore. I don't know what the intricacies of that might be, right? It's a very complex and coordinated attack. But we see it, people to use it their advantage in, on Instagram and Facebook, right, for money, and then to use it for nefarious purposes, a very, very challenging thing to defeat, right? Your best hope, like you said, is getting away as quickly as possible, but hopefully recognizing there's going to be something out of place, right, in that incident, that environment. Something's weird there. Recognize that, listen to your gut, right? It's the Gavin DeBecker, listen to your gut. The gift of fear. Listen to your gut, right? It's there for a reason. Don't discount it.
So let me run this by you. This is from other law enforcement officers that have told me, like, one of the things for a quick visual is to look at the footwear. That a lot of times these posers who are dressed up as a paramedic or a cop, they're not wearing footwear that you would expect to see on an officer. And then the next one that stands out to me in particular is what's on their duty belt. Like, if they don't have like handcuffs and a taser in addition to a pistol and all that stuff, they're probably not a cop. And if you're a technology guy like I am, I'm looking at the radio, because if it's a Baofeng radio, that is not a cop in America. If it's Kenwood, Motorola, Harris, anything but that. But what are your thoughts on the footwear in particular and the duty belt?
So footwear, I can tell you, would not work in New York City, because I'm aware of a lot of footwear that would not be to uniform standards. Okay. And again, it's just based on people's work environments, et cetera, lesser profiles, right? Things are a little bit more liberal in the Bronx with the uniform standard as opposed to, Midtown South Manhattan. Okay. So I don't think that would not be a tell for me, and again, if we're looking at the time aspect there for a civilian that's not familiar with what belongs on a duty belt or a gun belt. Again, mine was different from, my partners, so to speak. There were a couple of normal tools there, but you're starting to really slow down the clock, where let me kind of process what's going on there. And you're hitting that OODA loop over and over and over again. Very, very challenging. I don't know. I don't know if I would pick it out in New York City. For me, I would pick it out based on something else: the patch, collar brass, a cap device. But now we're talking about like almost minute details, because I think you can walk into Manhattan right now and see different variation of gun belts between New York City Police Department and the MTA Police Department. Both would be in Grand Central Station. Very, very challenging.
Yeah, for sure. But great advice. I didn't realize that you would expect to see different footwear because it's not something I've really honed in on. It was just a piece of advice
We're
given.
not LA. We're not as pretty as the LA guys and gals.
Well, that's interesting. You should mention them. I mean, I reference the LAPD SWAT team frequently as probably one of the best, if not the best, in the entire world.
Fantastic. Great. I mean, super. I mean, just a super competent group of people, right? And their uniform standard is, they're held to a higher uniform standard, I will say. I could say that comfortably.
George, give me your thoughts on neighborhood, like community integration, as far as like having these layered levels of readiness and prepping. Like, when does a family hit the wall, and at that point it now has to turn into a community thing, or they're basically in a bad spot?
I think after a prolonged period of time where the normal day-to-day life of people are affected. And I think that usually happens roughly at about 72 hours, where you get the CERT, the local county team that comes in with resources, ham radio operators, your American Red Crosses, et cetera, right? Like those resources take time to assemble, because they're not coming in the midst of the emergency, right? That emergency, like for Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, right? Like that, I was there for that. And that was, 24 hours before the initial threat to life was over, until the storm had passed, right? So like they could be staging in wherever they were, but they weren't coming for 24 hours because the storm was still going. And then it takes them time to get there, right? And again, prioritizing that. So I think to me, critically, there's a couple of things that the modern family needs, right? Can you be resilient for 36 hours? Most of the answer is yes. Can you be resilient for 72 hours? Okay, now we're starting to kind of tax your resources. Can you be resilient for 7 to 10 days, which we experienced here, right, for Hurricane Sandy? That was very unusual, right? From 72 hours past that, you saw other people, I witnessed it, other people trying to take other people's resources, right? So if you're thinking about, I can't be resilient for more than 3 days, and you need to go to a place to get, buy resilience or gain resilience where everybody else is going. And you talked about, the fragile, supply chain for food, et cetera, right? Don't go to those places where everybody else is going to go looking for the same resources when you could have had some of them. Again, it's the United States of America. We could plan for 30 days, but can you be resilient as a family for 12, 72, 7 days? Those to me would be a good place to start.
Yeah, build it out, right? So it's not so overwhelming. It's funny you should mention food, because one of our sponsors is Wasatch Wagyu. So this guy Greg, they're his cattle. They're 100% Wagyu. Man, there's something going on with Japan theme tonight in this conversation, George. I just nuked one of these because I'm severely addicted to them. It's incredible. Jerky. Check this out. So it's loaded up with the good fats, but it doesn't.
Wow, look at that.
It doesn't give your jaw work. I make sandwiches out of this stuff. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but between Mike Glover and I, we both have a serious problem with this.
I gotta check that
out. We're in therapy for it now. So, and it's not helping. We're still.
First step is admitting it.
Yeah, with zero desire to fix it. But hey, we have a discount code if you do go there, George, and they don't pay us affiliate either, but it's SD20, gets you 20% off. Their meat, like they'll sell for, meat across the country, which they don't like to do, but they will do it. It's $100 a pound for one of their tomahawks. So, I mean, this stuff here, 20% off is appreciable because it's cheap.
I'm sorry, Chris, but I'll bring up another anecdote. And if we go back to 2020, where COVID starts to kind of kick off, and you're talking about food and being resilient, and having that that Wagyu there is a fantastic thing to have, because I recall very vividly only being able to buy one package of chicken cutlets per day in the supermarket for a family of 4, right? And you weren't allowed to go anywhere, but you could go to the supermarket, once a day to get a one package of 4 chicken cutlets. It was that moment there that I said to myself, I'm going to, be resilient in the food category. And we had, some stockpiles of the freeze dried stuff, but that's when we started to, do our own harvesting, et cetera. But like having the ability, that stuff is worth its weight in gold, almost as a commodity. And, even trading that as a resource, heaven forbid things were really, really bad, but like it's just such a valuable resource to be able to have that and know that you're going to be okay.
Yeah, remind me to cash app that $20 to you for saying all those nice things.
It wasn't even scripted.
Listen, when I say Mike and I are addicted, I just cut another one open because I'm gonna eat it. To be quite frank, you can't. And don't make fun of me, but you can't run a V8 on a gallon of gas.
Right.
So I was gonna ask you a question at the end of this third segment here. If a family's done nothing, wants to start tonight, what's the first move, gives them the most immediate improvement, blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to take us directly to the practical payoff.
Okay.
So what the practical payoff is whatever topic that we're covering at the end of it, myself and whoever's on the panel with me, we each take a stab at one skill, one item, one mindset shift related to the topic at hand for our audience. I'm not going to give the audience my stuff tonight because I want to give you the floor, but let's start with a skill. Give me a skill that you would recommend everyday Americans, especially the people in the audience, acquire.
Hands down, bleeding control.
Wow.
Unequivocally. So again, a teaching anecdote here. If we go back to when I was a kid, growing up, and you became a lifeguard and you learned, American Red Cross first aid and CPR, right? That was the standard. And then 5 or 10 years later, you got to the point that, AEDs were introduced and you learn AED is the next stage of that. I feel bleeding control is that next evolution of what medicine looks like as it evolves. The problem that we have in the United States is that bleeding control is tied to firearms. And what I can tell you is that there are way more accidents, construction accidents, car accidents, et cetera, that need that sort of tourniquet bleeding control, et cetera. They've just equated it to firearms. So the teachingism that I will say is, when I was a kid and learned at 16 years old, learned CPR because everybody was dying of coronary artery disease, we didn't get mad at McDonald's and blame McDonald's. And then when I had to learn the AED, we didn't get mad at Wendy's and Burger King, right? But for whatever reason now that we're teaching the next evolution of what that medical involvement looks like, and that's bleeding control, but we've tied it to firearms, right? And that phenomenon. So I think it will. I mean, you could give a Girl Scout a merit badge for learning bleeding control. So I hope at some point, and I've heard anecdotally that it will be high school curriculum in a health class at some point in the future. I thought it would have happened by now, but bleeding is the number one or one of the top causes of preventable death. And it's you can teach a Girl Scout to do it. It's not hard.
Great advice. Great advice. I'm a big fan of the North American cat tourniquets myself. Not that makes me unique or anything. Give me one item. So one item people can acquire in light of tonight's conversation, basically starting right now. So we'll talk about an IFAC because I'll leave that as part of that. But I am a big Second Amendment guy. I think having lawful carry, concealed carry, et cetera, I think that's a very positive step. And again, it doesn't make you a gunfighter. It doesn't make you resilient, but I think, it gives you the ability to defend yourself with the appropriate level of training. And again, just become proficient with that tool, right? Like if you're a carpenter, you've got multiple saws and multiple hammers, right? Like to me, the firearm was a tool. It was nothing more than that, and I just would become proficient with my tool. Yeah, you can't go wrong there at all. So last one would be a mindset shift, something that people need to get their head wrapped around.
Do something hard every day. Very simple to me, right?
Well,
do something hard every day, like work on your resilience. Personally, I'm a cold plunge guy. I hit the cold plunge tonight before we jumped on air. I like the therapeutic effects of it, but I also like the fact that not everybody does it, right? Because it sucks. I enjoy it at this point. But just whatever. And if that hard thing is going for a walk because you don't normally go for a 15 or 30-minute walk after dinner, do something hard, and then again, improve your position. And maybe today it was 15 minutes of a walk, and then a month from now, it's 30 minutes for a walk. And then, take a loved one, take your dog, get out there and do something, that you normally wouldn't do, and raise that bar, raise that standard for yourself.
So I like the way you stated that, George. When I acquired this company, I was talking to Mike Glover and I said, "Hey, Mike, I got to ask you a question." He said, "Sure, what's that?" And I said, "Well, you've been at this a long time." I said, "Here's my perception of the survival prepping audience." I said, "My impression is that they want to learn as long as it's not a heavy lift with a sprinkling of entertainment." And he laughed and he said, "Man, that's a great way to describe it." So we learned this lesson the hard way. If we say to people, you need to whatever, you need to do all this exercise, you need to eat this diet, you need to do all that, right. People just tune it out because they've got too much going on in their lives to do all of the things all of the time, right? So your advice was great. Just do like one small thing. Just move the needle, even if it's this far, and it adds up. It's like eating an elephant or eating Wasatch Wagyu jerky, because I'm fixing to wipe this one out too. But yeah, great advice on your part, George. So I'm not going to do a sit rep tonight because I've tied you up for a couple hours already, and I really appreciate your time. Look forward to hopefully you coming back and joining us, George. I've got all kinds of direct messages coming in saying that they love what you had to say.
Thank you.
Clearly, you've got a ton of anecdotal examples. And, I like to say, the plural of anecdote isn't data, but I mean, anecdotes coming from somebody's perspective like yours are absolutely priceless. So with that being said, last shout out, you should check these guys out, by the way, George, at carnivalt.com.
I wrote that one down too. I wrote down Mad Planner. What's the Wagyu one, Chris? I got to check out the Wagyu one too.
Yeah, so the Wagyu one is wasatchwagyu.com, and it's WASA TCH Wagyu.com. SD20 is the discount. The Carnivalt stuff, last year beef wholesale went up 49%. When people sign up for a subscription for Carnivalt, it locks the meat price in for 12 months because they're not allowed to raise the price because of the states they operate out of for 12 months when somebody signs up. So where else are you getting a 49%, return on investment? And that's not to mention the fact that it's 100% American beef, no mRNA, no histamines, grass finished, not just grass fed. The bags made in America, the O2 absorbers are made in America. And I mean, they're poisoning our food with all kinds of things these days. So that's a great option. And of course, Wasatch Wagyu, I've never seen jerky like this before. I'm telling you, it is incredibly pliable. Some of the audience heard me tell this, but you'll get a kick out of this, George. So I'm sitting right here in my chair, and my wife walks in with this big bag from Greg at Wasatch Wagyu, and she says, "Oh, Greg sent you another bag of jerky." And she hands it to me, and I open it up, and I grab one out of it, and she looks at me, and she says, "Those are for snacks. They're not for meals." So I look over my shoulder at her like this, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm not going to agree with that." So she had to be in Orlando that day. She comes home, later on. She says, "What'd you have for lunch today?" I said, "I had a Wasatch Wagyu dill, pickle, and mustard sandwich, and it was outstanding." So
I'm definitely going to try it. You've convinced me. But again, this is why I'm so fortunate, because the exposure that I get, again, I think I'm competent in a lot of areas, but you can always learn more, right? Improve my position more. And the three resources that you talked about tonight, I wasn't aware of, but they're absolutely viable resources, right? And that's what I hope to be able to give to the people that listen.
I'm going to start referring to you as Captain Kaizen. Everything's continuous.
My skis are called Kaizen, actually. The skis that I brought this year are Kaizen.
That's too funny. So anyway, thanks again, George. And for all y'all out there, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Please turn the notifications on. We're working with CommiTube to try and fix our big channel with 446,000 subscribers. And part of it is a lot of y'all don't have your notifications turned on. So please turn your notifications on for that. But outside of that, George, thank you once again. I appreciate your insight. And God bless our law enforcement officers. God bless our military. God bless America. And enjoy the closing video.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes, sir.
The Democrat open borders plan to entrench single-party rule, explained in under 2 minutes. 1. Flood the country with untold millions of illegals by land, sea, and air from all over the world, enough to eclipse the populations of 36 individual U.S. states so far. 2. Prioritize the needs of these millions of non-citizens over the needs of the American citizen, with free flights, buses, hotels, meals, and phones, ensuring their loyalty to the political party that imported them. 3. Keep them in the country at all costs, even when they commit violent crime like murder and rape. Attack the language used to describe the criminals, as opposed to the criminals themselves. Slander critics as racist. 4. Ensure their privileges are made irrevocable with city and state sanctuary laws that act as population magnets. Codify permanent status and ensure non-cooperation with ICE. 5. Count the non-citizens in the census that will determine congressional apportionment in the House of Representatives. As of now, that would equal 13 extra congressional districts, a tremendous amount of electoral power. 6. Wage a massive, heavily funded lawfare campaign to change state voting laws that legalize mass mail-in ballots, no signature verification, and no proof of citizenship requirements, making it nearly impossible to prove voter fraud. 7. Lock in the permanent voting majority with campaign promises of lavish benefits and permanent privileges, enshrining generational fealty to the Democrat Party. 8. Win elections. 9. Entrenched single-party rule has been achieved. The best part? Your tax dollars are paying for it.